The US President Donald Trump is due to meet the Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. That will happen in the evening when this comes out, in order to hash out an end to the Ukraine war. Tom, this is undoubtedly significant, but probably the most notable thing about it, the most notable absence, is that there will be no one from Ukraine there, as these two rulers decide, presumably, how territory will be carved up, the terms of the peace.
Absolutely. And I think the kind of great power optics is quite intentional. You have both in Trump and in Putin people who quite value that kind of status placed upon themselves as the kind of great powers deciding what's what. The fact that they're meeting in Alaska is pretty significant. Obviously, it's a US state, US territory, but it was Russian for 150 years as a kind of... And also the fact that it's so far away from the conflict in which it's discussing is kind of telling. I think we'll also see, and by the time people watch this, they'll know a lot more than we currently do, that this meeting wasn't exclusively about Ukraine as well. There'll be about kind of other matters that of interest between the two to be thrashed out there. And obviously it's fundamentally galling because of the fact that Ukraine aren't present. I mean, there's a certain element to this, which is the fact that any kind of peace that is arrived at is going to be incredibly unpalatable for Ukraine, even if many of the people within the Ukrainian political class and even increasingly in the population at large kind of coming to the conclusion, if you look at the polls and if you look at the reporting, that some kind of deeply horrific but unsatisfactory but kind of at this point almost necessary peace needs to be struck is an increasing sentiment you see reported. So in a sense, the absence of Zelensky is kind of useful to him in the sense that this is something that he or people around him might have come to see as inevitable, but it's important that his fingerprints aren't necessarily all over it. What form it takes, again, it's really unclear. It's unclear to see if any genuine peace is going to be successful, not least because it's not absolutely clear where Putin's mind is on this particular question. It seems most likely that if that were to take place, that it's kind of a freezing of the current lines in the war, with Russia having brutally seized 20% of Ukrainian territory. You've got the Russians kind of making these over-the-top claims that they want to, seize the entirety of the oblast, the 4 oblasts that they've formally claimed but don't actually genuinely control. But it seems like what we might end up with is, as Mark Rutte from NATO described it this week, is kind of de facto, if not de jure, recognition of Russia's control, if not legitimate control, over the territory that it's taken. But it's a really grim milestone, and it's a reminder, I think, that there's always been this kind of central paradox at the heart of Ukraine's valiant fight for national survival, for national sovereignty against this imperialistic foe who entered its territory, is that it was always reliant on external support, and that was absolutely necessary. It was completely unavoidable, but it also meant that if you ended up with a change in the political weather, if you ended up with a new administration, and also because of the fact that even though, say, Trump's predecessor was much more kind of vocal in his support for Ukraine, there was obviously only so far that even Joe Biden was willing to go. Yeah. So even though this might be a point that has been coming for some time, not least because of the facts on the ground, the war, Zelensky's increasing domestic political legitimacy problems, increasing collapse in the military manpower and so on, it doesn't sweeten the pill at all for Ukrainians or anyone who just cares for their fight for national sovereignty.
Definitely. And Claire, I mean, there's obviously, the sort of moral dimension of Ukraine being excluded. There's also the sort of geopolitical interest of basically Europe not having any kind of seat at the table. And the most they've been able to do, European leaders, is to sort of try and sway Trump. And you hear these sort of Trump reports about whether they've successfully whispered him into backing Ukraine. It is a bit of an embarrassment for what would have been, part of the world that would have been an important global power.
It's actually really depressing, because following the media on this and trying to follow the way that European leaders have interacted with Trump in relation to this, talk about powerlessness, because, it's all like, I think we've persuaded Trump to understand. It's like this, as you say, it's like Trump whispering. Now, you don't have to be involved in Trump derangement syndrome or be obsessed with getting rid of the Trump government to notice that it's a very precarious situation when you're relying on whether, as Donald Trump himself says, the president himself says, I'll know the first minute I walk in the room what I'm going to do. And it's like, oh, God. And also his or the inability of the American state to acknowledge properly that this was an entirely illegitimate invasion of a sovereign country in the first instance. The fact that that is just not clearly stated anymore by the Americans does get on my nerves. But I also think that Tom made reference to Biden. I think we've got to be really honest here and say that it was precisely Biden and the European powers who kind of clung on Biden's coattails, because they certainly weren't contributing anything like financially to this, that basically made this a kind of slow drip of not enough support to Ukraine. This could have actually been resolved. I mean, it is quite feasible that earlier on, with the right kind of determination and Western backing, that Russia could have been given a bloody nose. Because even the bravery of the Ukrainian forces at the beginning, and with the kind of support that they could have got but didn't get, could have really kind of been a setback for Putin. But instead, it's dragged on and on and on and on. And now it does mean that, there's internal problems in Ukraine. It means that things are much more unstable. So I'm not trying to just blame Trump at all. Europe might now say, oh, we're prepared to pay now. We are prepared to step up, but only kind of a little bit. And so you're right. They don't feel as though they've got any real say or sway in what the decisive discussion is going to be. And that they're not in the room is indicative of that, I think. And they're having to do Zoom calls earlier on. We've had a Zoom call in which they kind of, it's like a court, isn't it? Where you kind of put forward your, dear Mr. President, we'd like to say on behalf of France or Germany's view on this. You know what I mean? It's like he is very much the dominant figure. I think that says more about Europe than it does about Trump.
No, on the Europe question, I think it really has exposed a lot of the cant and the hypocrisies where Ukraine is concerned. First of all, European leaders and the European Union, they're very good at issuing statements and making tweets and so on. I stand with Ukraine and what have you. But when it comes to actually delivering the kind of support that would allow Ukraine to defend itself, both in this conflict and also in some kind of messy peace that we're potentially going to see in the near future, that was always lacking. There is obviously, even though if the figures will constantly be quoted to you that together the European continent has given more to Ukraine than America has, but they don't have the kind of weaponry that Ukraine actually needs. A lot of that money is just going to kind of paying wages in the Ukrainian government and in the military setup and so on. It's sort of subsidy in many respects. Also, for all of the talk in recent months that we're going to have some sort of coalition of the willing, which is going to support Ukraine regardless of what the Americans do. I mean, first of all, that was always pretty explicitly premised on the fact we would need American support in doing so, perhaps even American air cover. So the idea that this is Europe going alone was never obviously clear. And also the fact that it's been exposed by this war from the very beginning, which is that, many European countries have militaries, which is about 5 blokes in a packet of quavers. I mean, it's been absurd to see people talking in increasingly bellicose terms about Russia in European capitals, whilst being incapable of defending their own borders where the chips to be down at any point. And even the question of, Russian gas and oil. I mean, because of the fact that you've got European countries, because they are so exposed energy-wise, because they have pursued so many disastrous, ruinous net zero policies and so on, continuing to buy Russian gas, not placing any sanctions on these things, you can understand why they're doing it. But at the same time, this is a point that Owen Matthews made in The Spectator recently, effectively Europe has put more into the coffers of the Russian war machine that has Ukraine's over the course of these few years. Now, this is not to say that these aren't countries making difficult decisions in difficult circumstances. The idea that there were going to be an American government or a British government or whatever who would be willing to get into direct conflict with Russia over Ukraine, I think was always for the birds. There's no domestic appetite for that amongst the population as much as anything else. But this has been the story of this conflict, and in the run up to it as well, is various Western powers in rhetoric and in action kind of essentially kind of, first of all, just writing checks they can't cash, but also some in many cases kind of provoking or prolonging when they have no any interest in actually backing up the kind of claims or threats that they're making at any one point.
Yeah, I just want to very quickly, because I think that one of the things that would have been required, say in the UK, in order to justify increasing expenditure or what have you in that area, would have been a public debate. And of course, like everything else, there hasn't been one. Now, I might be well and truly, 110% on the side of Ukraine and think that this is they are worth backing. But I'm also aware of the fact that, it's assumed that we all support Ukraine. That's not the same as actually people supporting Ukraine, right? You sometimes have to go out and win an argument. And of course, the argument would be that this is a sovereign state and that sovereignty really matters. A sovereign European state whose sovereignty has been invaded, that borders are the thing. And as Tom says, to get a British politician to go out and argue for sovereignty and borders mattering is actually hard. You'd be hard pressed, right? If you put those kind of arguments, you might be able to convince, ordinary people in this country that this is something worth stepping up for. And by which I mean really putting our money where our mouths are. Instead, what we get is a kind of assumption, a kind of moral righteousness about we're on the right side. We've got to increase the defence budget. And then we've discovered that actually when they do increase the defence budget, probably a lot of it's going to have gone on covering up their Afghan leak cover-up. Did you see what I mean? A lot of the defence budget is going to go, it would appear, on a wide range, that you were talking about the border force or that Quango they've set up in relation to, looks like it might go on that. In other words, it's not clear to me at all that they have been straight with us about what we would need to do in order to support Ukraine. And that's what you would need to do.
Yeah. And just finally, I suppose, to bring it back to Ukraine itself, and if we end up with the beginnings of some kind of messy, intolerable peace at the end of this, it's worth remembering that, of course, it will be intolerable, effectively having to live with 20% of your territory being under the control of an imperialistic aggressor. If you think about the populations already living under that rule there, the tens of thousands of children who've been spirited from Ukraine into Russia, taken away, brainwashed and so on. There's not been any really discussion in going into this Alaska summit about what is going to happen where any of those things are concerned. I suppose, whilst it's not going to be immediately felt by the Ukrainians so ravaged by this war for 3 years, but one thing I think it's worth challenging, the idea that all of this was sort of for nothing. You often get this on the kind of anti-Ukraine side, that they should have just rolled over, essentially, that that's even some of the milder of their critiques. They actually see Ukraine as the kind of villain in the piece, but at worst, or just the kind of unthinking puppet of the West at best. But if you think about just how much they could have lost, if you think about the column of tanks rolling on Kiev, if you think about the amount of territory that in the first months Russia was able to seize before you had those incredible counter-offensives in November 2022, really pushing back the lines, things have been pretty grinding and attritional since then. But precisely that combination of fighting for something that matters, your nation, your family, your friends, with the support and solidarity of the West, yes, but certainly with the ingenuity and spirit of the Ukrainian people themselves, they have given Putin a bloody nose in one way, shape or form. It might not be everything that they want or deserve, but it's been nevertheless a tremendous historic fight that they have mounted for themselves and for precisely the values of nationhood and sovereignty that we all claim to care about.